Hello, everyone who is watching, who's tuned into the webinar. Hopefully everyone can hear me clearly and see the content. Yeah, just to kick off the webinar. So this is going to be essentially a demo of our new Kubernetes series. My name is Matt Parven, and I'm one of the cloud security content engineers at Immersive Labs, and also involved in leading the cloud product line, which is something that you're going to be seeing a lot of this year. Covering all things cloud, from Kubernetes, container security, all the way to Amazon Web Services, Azure, Google Cloud Platform. So Immersive Labs was founded to help businesses equip cybersecurity teams in a new way. And today, this is our vision, that every business can have confidence in the expertise tasked with leading, defending, and building in security. So the responsibility for securing organizations now falls beyond just operational security teams who sit at the front line. There are other key areas carrying an important role in effective cybersecurity. Human cyber readiness brings clear advantages for those groups too. So at the top, we've got business leaders. They certainly want confidence in the capabilities of teams to keep the organization secure, but they also are looking to test their own decision-making in the event of a crisis, alongside the most senior executives. Cybersecurity teams are the front line in testing for weaknesses, understanding adversaries, hunting down threats, applying new security controls, and responding to incidents. And these teams need to be equipped to use the relevant new tool sets, as well as regularly exercising how to use them as the threat landscape evolves and expands. And at the bottom left, development and engineering teams, they have a challenging relationship with security, as it can sometimes be seen as a barrier to building. And these teams must be equipped to understand and identify vulnerabilities in a way that isn't just compulsory, but that begins to embed a security first mindset. And the security hiring teams, they're obviously hiring for roles where security skills are required to have their own set of challenges, and not just understanding the basics. So the Kubernetes series. So as I said in the previous slide, this series sort of aimed towards cybersecurity teams and development and engineering teams. Cybersecurity teams being kind of like the responders, or the people who are sitting in the security operations center, who might be responding to threats, or carrying out forensics or looking at logs, and the development and engineering teams who will be ensuring that Kubernetes deployments, clusters, nodes are correctly secured following best practices. So what is Kubernetes? So if anyone on the webinar doesn't know, it's an open source system for automating deployment, scaling, and management of containerized applications. It's an open source project which is hosted by the CNCF, and there's a number of different distributions you'll probably find in the wild. You've got MicroK, K3D, and there's a lot of other ones. So why have we built a series on Kubernetes? So more and more companies nowadays are deploying Kubernetes to leverage its benefits, but obviously attacks in the cloud continue to rise, and Kubernetes deployments are often being a very big target. They have a very large attack surface. When you consider the applications that you're deploying on them could have vulnerabilities, the actual Kubernetes cluster itself could have vulnerabilities, and there's a lot of kind of interesting data out there at the moment pointing towards Kubernetes being quite a large target at the moment, especially with things like crypto miners and people wanting to get on to install malicious pods and things like that. So the purpose of this series is essentially to teach the fundamentals of Kubernetes to users unfamiliar with the technology. So if you haven't used it before, then there are labs in this series that will get you to grips with the basics, what it does, how to interact with it. And then obviously we've got gaining understanding of how to secure Kubernetes deployments, so things like how to use secrets properly, network policies, etc. And from a blue team perspective, gaining skills on how to delve into logs within Kubernetes and how to perform audits. And then also from an offensive perspective, an understanding on how to actually attack Kubernetes clusters. So there's a lot covered in that series. So at the moment, there's 15 labs in the series, with more due soon. And similar to the last slide, they cover 3 main disciplines. The first one being fundamentals, so how to actually use it. And then blue team, kind of secure engineering, which is how to configure and respond to incidents. And then red team, which is how to attack Kubernetes. and that's at the moment there's 6 hours of content, and it ranges from difficulty 3 being the fundamentals all the way up to 8, which is kind of our quite difficult challenge labs for people who have either picked up the skills through the labs to gain the experience, or someone who's coming in who's used Kubernetes before and might have a lot of experience with the various security issues you might see in the real world. So I'm going to get off to a quick demo of the series. I don't want to give too much away, so I'm not going to be completing any labs for you. That's for the users to do. But anyway, so how you get to the labs. So if you go to Browse, we've got a new section called Cloud Security on the left. And if you go into there, you've got a range of different series here: NIST, NCSC, Terraform, Amazon Web Services, and then you've got Kubernetes here in the middle as well. So just look for the blue icon. And if you go into there, you can see all of the labs that we've got. There's 2 pages of them currently, and they're kind of laid out in a way in which we'd expect you to complete them. So going from the introduction to Kubernetes all the way through to our last lab, which is this lot here. And these will take you, as I said, from the fundamentals, sort of pods and services, all the way up to attacking the Kubernetes API, etc. So if we drop into one of the labs now, the introduction, this is essentially going over the basics of Kubernetes, what it does, how pods and containers are deployed to it, the various components, and how all the individual APIs that make up Kubernetes work. So API server, things like the Kubernetes API, with a mini game to test your knowledge on that. It also links back to the Containers Lab, which isn't a part of this series, but this lab will teach you about containers, Docker, and things like that, as they are essentially what will be deployed in a Kubernetes cluster, what will be ran. So once you've completed that lab, the next lab you'll probably go into is pod and services. This lab goes over kind of what a pod is, what a service is, how services interact with pods. As you can see, there's a couple of diagrams, kind of getting you used to YAML files and how selectors work and how to front applications. So if I want my Nginx deployment to be on port 8080, etc., and things like that. So if I show you here, these labs are obviously fresh sandbox environments with your own Kubernetes cluster, and you can interact with it. It's all pre-set up for you. So yeah. So after pods and services, you'll probably go on to something like logging. I don't want to cover every lab, but I just kind of want to give you just a quick overview of kind of what the sort of labs you'll see. Logging is kind of a blue team focused lab. It will go over how to kind of look into pods, look into the log output of them, and how to investigate what's happening in the actual pod itself. So that's what the tasks look like. And then we move on to something like attacking the Kubernetes API. This is an offensive focus lab, which you'll need to essentially attack a default installation of Kubernetes. And it talks about the vulnerabilities that exposed Kubernetes API can have, which is quite a common attack we see a lot against Kubernetes clusters. If the installation of Kubernetes isn't locked down at a network layer or with the correct anonymous auth flags being set, your Kubernetes API can be exposed, and that can lead to attackers very easily taking control of the cluster completely and installing something like potentially a crypto miner or just exfiltrating data from your pods, depending on what they do. The interesting thing about this lab is the actual Kubernetes API obviously is open source, just like Kubernetes, but the actual API itself is undocumented. So it's quite an interesting lab because it takes you through where exactly in the code you need to look to find these kind of vulnerabilities. And then it also talks you through how you leverage them. So how to make use of the different APIs that are exposed, and how to go all the way from here where we can just see the running pods in the Kubernetes cluster, all the way through to actually essentially escalating your privileges from the pod all the way up to the actual cluster itself. So having control of API server, and at that point you basically control the cluster and you can do what you want. So it's quite a good lab, and I think it really kind of drives home how dangerous Kubernetes deployments can be if they're not properly configured. especially following best practice. So this will also talk you through exactly why this attack can take place and what you can do to stop it from happening. And there's also, this is episode 1, but there are other episodes that will shortly be released which continue to demonstrate how these attacks can be used against Kubernetes API. So once you've kind of gone through these sort of labs and you've picked up some skills, you'll probably find yourself in one of the more difficult labs, like the Kubernetes vulnerable web application. This is a challenge lab, so there isn't much information, but it puts together kind of all of the knowledge you've learned in the previous labs, and essentially puts you in the position of an attacker or a penetration tester to attack a web application which is being hosted on Kubernetes, and you have to go in, attack the web application, escalate your privileges to eventually taking control of the full cluster or pruning the cluster. And it's a really good lab. It is a difficulty level 8, but I shouldn't let anyone shy away from that, because if you do complete the previous labs in this series, it does give you the skills you need to essentially do this lab. So as a question, how can we get the answer for labs if we are stuck? So I would say this series gives you quite a lot of information to be able to complete the labs. You shouldn't need too many hints and tips, as in like you shouldn't need to be given the answer. These are quite detailed in their information, and yeah, I think you can persevere. Shouldn't worry, as long as you read the information clearly and you do the labs in order, as you can see on this window here. You shouldn't have too many issues. It does go from the fundamentals, as I said. So even if you haven't used Kubernetes before, it does give you a lot of experience with just interacting with Kubernetes, what a pod is, and how to use kubectl, which you'll use a lot in these series. So yeah, there are a couple of other labs that I've not covered. Namespaces and network policies, which is another good one. This will kind of go over how namespaces work in Kubernetes and how to apply network policies to various pods. Something that you'll probably do quite often if you're involved in deploying Kubernetes. And this lab will kind of talk you through some of the best practices and how it works. And another good one if you're kind of involved in securing Kubernetes or deploying it securely, role-based access control, which will talk you through how RBAC needs to be configured and set up in Kubernetes and how you can do that. So I would definitely recommend giving those labs a go. I'm just going to end that. Don't know if there are any other questions at this point. No. Okay. Yeah, I don't think there's really much else to cover from the lab perspective. I would definitely say to go and give it a go, and as I say, follow it through in the order it's laid out in the series. If you're experienced with Kubernetes, you could maybe skip some of the fundamentals labs, so maybe the first 3. But I would do it anyway just to refresh your knowledge, and you may pick something up that you didn't know about previously. So I would probably recommend just doing it in the order anyway. So yeah, so that was the Kubernetes Labs. There's a lot of movement at the moment in our cloud security product. We've got a lot of labs coming very shortly to the platform, covering a lot of different aspects of cloud security. AWS is one that we're working on at the moment. So we'll be covering full practical labs on things like S3, EC2, and CloudTrail. We'll be going into a lot of detail in things like how to configure CloudTrail, how to configure EC2 securely, but also how to attack AWS if you're a pen tester, how to go about performing reconnaissance and things like that. The NIST and NCSE cloud guidance. So if you're involved in compliance, those labs got released last month, sorry. So you can go and give those. They basically cover compliance in the cloud, best practice according to NIST and NCSE. And they've obviously got Terraform, which is also on the platform, which will go through infrastructure as code and how to deploy Terraform securely. And Azure is another thing that will be coming this year. So similarly to AWS, we'll be covering practical labs in Azure, covering a lot of the different Azure services, very similar to AWS, but we're going into a lot of detail and releasing more information on that hopefully very soon. I know that was only 15 minutes. I'd hope potentially we'd get a few more questions, and I don't want to go into too much depth in the labs. I think I've covered off the main kind of principle of these labs and what we're trying to teach the users. Don't know if there are any other questions about the series or anything anyone wants to know apart from any answers for the labs. Can we share our Kubernetes badge publicly, like on LinkedIn? I think you can. Yeah, I think if you complete the series and you get the badge, there's no reason why you can't share it. I don't think there's any kind of inbuilt way of doing it in the platform right now, so you can't click a button to share it to LinkedIn. But if you were to take like a screenshot of it and crop it, I think that's definitely fine. That's pretty cool. I would definitely do that personally if I got the badge, which I don't right now. Don't think there's any other questions right now. So I'm just trying to fix my window so I can see the questions properly. Sorry, 2 seconds. Do you see any new content coming? So the question is, do you see any new content coming around specifically Kubernetes IR forensics? Yeah, I do definitely. At the moment, we've kind of got how you would perform logging and auditing and things like that. But we haven't got a lab on how you make for example, an attack has taken place, go in and retrieve this information. And that's a really good idea, and it's something that we've definitely got on the roadmap for Kubernetes. So we will be kind of going over that. There's also a lot of third-party tools for Kubernetes, which is designed for forensics and things like that. So we're hoping to kind of cover off some common vendor technology that you might see, or common kind of tools that you might see in the wild that IR forensics professionals might use for Kubernetes. Definitely. I keep saying Kubernetes. Sorry. I have a question, but not sure it's fitting here. I would love if the info task panel in the labs could be popped out into a separate page section. So I don't want to give anything away because I'll get into trouble, but that's something that may come that's something that may come true for you very soon. I have only just started the series and new to Kubernetes and found the info very informative. Awesome, thank you. Yeah, it's definitely a good series. When we kind of did the alpha kind of testing for it, people who hadn't used it before thought it was a good series to get them into the whole how containerization works, how Kubernetes works from a fundamentals perspective, but also dipping their toes into the security aspects of it as well. There's a question, if you become stuck on any of the modules, is there any external links we should look at for help? If the lab doesn't give you any external links in the info panel, I would say to Google potentially anything on that subject area. So if you're doing a lab on, for example, I don't know, if I use Kubernetes as an example, if you're doing a lab on like logging and you're stuck, Googling Kubernetes logging and maybe reading the documentation in a bit more depth and maybe what's given to you in the info panel can normally help. We do obviously try our best in the labs to give you as much information as you need to complete the lab, but if you find yourself not getting anywhere, turning to either official documentation or kind of like write-ups and blogs online can sometimes help. But obviously official documentation was probably the first thing I would go to. So the question is it possible to get help if I communicate you or your colleagues? So I think if you're asking there, can you ask us for help? We do have a kind of support line, but that's more for like bugs in labs. We wouldn't really provide any sort of help if you are stuck. There are a few different communities online for Immersive Labs which you can join, which could help you in that regard. So the question, it's not really a question, but it's a comment. So excited to get started. And the question is, do you know when the Azure AWS Labs might be released on unknown timeline? So it definitely this year. AWS is currently being built as we speak. So hopefully either this quarter or next quarter. Azure probably more towards the end of the year. Would you recommend any other labs as a prereq to this? So the container lab is quite good. If you do a search on the platform, anything to do with Docker, it kind of depends on what your skill level is. If you've never used Kubernetes before, then probably don't need a prereq at all. If you're kind of like, sometimes we get people who are new to Linux altogether, so they might be an expert in security compliance, but they've never really got their hands dirty in Linux and that sort of thing. If you're kind of at that stage, then I would just have a look around the platform for anything to do with Linux or how to use the command line. It might sound basic, but if you are stuck with things like that, they can help. But generally, if you know your way around Linux, etc., and how, I guess, basic network concepts like ports, then you shouldn't really have an issue. But we do have labs on those sort of things on the platform, so yeah, you should be able to just have a search if you do find that they're a little bit out of your depth at the beginning. But it definitely, I think you should be okay. Let's check for some more questions. One challenge I found is that it's a whole new set of terminology. Yeah, if you're talking about Kubernetes, yeah, there's a lot of terminology in there, a lot of things you wouldn't have heard apart from if you had experience with Kubernetes. But I guess I'd look at that as a benefit of doing the labs, in that you come away and you've heard of those terminologies before, and so if they're ever used again kind of in your professional career, you'll be like, I know what that is. That's something to do with Kubernetes. I know what a node port is. There's a couple of other questions about reaching out for help, which again, we don't really facilitate anything like that. If you are stuck, I would just potentially refer to the official documentation, or look online for any of the Immersive Labs communities to join. There's a couple out there. I think there's one on Slack as well, which you could join. But we can't ourselves give you answers. Let's give it a couple minutes if there's any other last questions. As I say, some of the ones that I haven't answered are more to do with giving answers away, which I've already kind of explained why I'm not going to do that. Cool. Okay, I think that's all of the questions I'm able to answer. As I say, kind of a last comments. Yeah, if you're new to Kubernetes, just follow the series as it is. So starting with the introduction to Kubernetes and follow them through. You will definitely learn a lot. If you do get stuck and the lab itself isn't helping you, as in the info panel, you've read it a couple of times, you're still not able to answer the questions, potentially refer to the official documentation. And you should be fine. Perseverance is always going to help you in these labs, but they're not. Yeah, the info should be enough. And as I say, if I go back to the slides quickly, there is a lot of movement right now from our cloud products. Kubernetes and kind of Terraform and NIST and NCC is what we have at the moment, but there is a big AWS and Azure will be coming, and there's a big push for those at the moment. So if you're kind of enjoying the cloud aspect of our labs, then there's definitely more coming this year, and it's a big product. So yeah, get yourself ready. Cool. Yeah, there's no more questions. We are finishing a little bit early, but I hope that was of some use to everyone who is watching the webinar. So yeah, I will end it there. Thank you, everyone.